So I'm Amanda Konopko. I work at FFW, and I am the lead content designer there. We are a mix of UX practitioners and content strategists, and we're going to be talking about content today.
I'm Cheney Kouraniotis. I also work at FFW. I am the Director of Client Success, which is one of those lovely vague titles that enables me to work with both prospective and current clients about the strategy related to their web redesign and redevelopment projects, and really help our clients sort of think through the type of planning and strategy that they need to do in order to make their project successful.
I'm Jake Fisher. I'm an account executive for the enterprise team here at Contentful. And Contentful is a leading composable content management system. And I work closely with my prospects and customers to align our solution with their needs.
Hi, my name is Marvin, and I'm a solutions engineer with Contentful. And I've been working in the digital transformation space for almost 10 years, working with content, but I work closely with the enterprise teams alongside Jake, and just look forward to having this discussion on what content is.
That's right. That sounds like something we want to put Amanda on the spot for. Like, what is content? We're going to get philosophical.
Let
today.
the content designer do it.
That's
Yep.
right. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So content is a little bit of everything now. It's not just what you would think maybe a few years ago, which is, you're coming to a website and it's copy. It's not just copy anymore. It's going to be all of your digital assets as well. It's going to be some pieces like augmented reality. And when you're thinking about how to manage this content, because it's now ever growing, it's not just copy anymore, it's all of these things coming together. You really need to think about how you're going to structure that content, because you're building a system. You're not just thinking about, okay, how do I get this news article up onto my site now? You have to think about that news article maybe being pushed to many different digital touch points, not just that one website anymore.
And that's actually a really good point. Something we talk a lot about at Contentful is this concept of core, create once, reuse everywhere. And this idea of removing the content from the context, where in the old days, sort of legacy technology, you would write a blog post to fit your definition of what a blog post should look like on your site because you had no other option. Right? And once that blog was published as a blog in its fully structured form and in its hierarchy of what it was, that content's there and only there. And this sort of new paradigm that we're looking at now is all about taking what elements of that blog are really pulling from other content that we've already created. Where should we be reusing it? Where else do we want our customers and prospects and whoever our target audience is, how do we want them interacting with these different elements of the content itself?
It sounds like it's a little bit of a way of kind of managing greater complexity, right? So to Amanda's point, content is more complicated than it used to be. Organizations are more complicated than they used to be. Websites and digital platforms are more complicated than they used to be. And it sounds like sort of like the traditional model that a lot of content authors are used to is just not sufficing, or it's taking too long, or it's slowing down people's ability to get new content, new information, new products to market.
Yeah. How does that, speaking of the most complex thing in the world, digital transformations at organizations, how do you guys see, as you're working and consulting with your customers, how do you see this concept of a content model or this new approach to content fitting into broader digital transformation?
Well, I think before we jump in, we should define what a content model is. Because a lot of people come to us asking, what is a content model? Why do I need it?
Right.
And a content model is really taking a look at all of the content within your ecosystem, looking at the structure that content needs, and then looking at the relationships between the content so that you can do a system design that is really going to allow you to have omni-channel content strategies.
When you're thinking about digital transformation, right? Like it's a good point, because I do think this is not only a change in potentially technology for how organizations manage their content, it's a change in the way they think about content, it's a change in the way they function with it, right? So digital transformation is one of those terms that gets kind of thrown around a lot in the industry. It's kind of a fun buzzword. But a lot of people, when they think about it, they think about, oh, I'm swapping out my tech stack. I'm getting a new CMS, or I'm getting like new software or something like that for my system. But at FFW, we think about it a couple different ways. And one of which is really rethinking how your digital platform, your digital presence supports your organizational mission, supports your business, and how does it need to function in order to do that. And so from a content perspective, we often find we've got clients coming to us saying, right, I've got 5, 10, 20 years worth of, as you said, sort of individually placed pieces of content copy on a specific page. I can no longer manage the levels that it's gotten to. And that can be challenging from an organizational perspective. It can be challenging from a technical perspective, right? Because it can, like, I have worked with sites that struggle with performance because of how much old content they're weighed down with. And so we really start to think about digital transformation in a sense of what is the platform supposed to do for your organization? And by extension, how is it supposed to function for your users? And your users are both external in this case and internal, right? So of course, we always want to think about a user-centric content structure, right? Where in which we're thinking about how the users of your site or your platform are interacting with what you have to offer them, but also your content authors, right? That's pretty critical too. If you want to get to market quickly with the information and the products or the press release, whatever it is that you're trying to put out there, your content authors need to be able to function efficiently. And traditional CMSs really, in a lot of cases, are struggling to keep up with that need as organizations grow.
That really gets back to the core methodology where you may have a product that you're entering content for, and maybe that product needs to be in a catalog, it needs to be on a website, it needs to be in marketing campaigns that you're running that are maybe not on your website. And a content editor doesn't want to have to repeat that content in all different systems. They want to be able to push that content out and be able to reuse it so that it saves them time, it's efficient, and it's not based on the layout or the way that the content looks anymore. It's really based on the structure of the content so that you can push it out to those systems.
Yeah, and that's a great point from the perspective of what you mentioned about what content is now. So content's not just copy anymore. Not only is it just not copy, but it's also not copy for just one channel. And so now the content model is the way to start capturing, a lot of the hows. Like, oh, here's this piece of content that I create. How am I going to use it? That can be captured in the content model so that when, from a technical perspective, we need to disseminate it to different channels, that's captured in the content model. Blog article may not be necessarily the right content to be putting out in a Twitter post. So how is that going to be modeled within that as a Twitter post and things like that, or X or whatever it's called now in terms of that.
That's right.
It also gives a lot of play to designers where they're able to kind of take this structure that you're creating and then create these beautiful experiences around it, because it's not, you're decoupling the layout from content now, which is great.
Yeah, well, and it sounds like the other aspect of transformation that I think comes into play here is not just enabling your content authors to do that, but sort of helping them think about it differently. And I imagine you guys have had some experiences with sort of the different ways in which you're transforming your customers' ways of thinking about their content in order to make it more accessible across touch points.
Yeah, absolutely. One, it was mentioned earlier, augmented reality. So there are now situations, and we see this already on our phones, where you open up Google Maps, you might be lost, it tells you to hold up your camera, scan it around, and it tells you exactly where you are. That's actual content now, where those buildings are, what those buildings are, having that being modeled out as content, and getting that structure set up properly so that technologies like Google Maps and others can actually render that on different devices, not just on your phone, but also on, a website or whatever it is that you're using at that time. So things are getting more complex, as was mentioned, which also makes it complex for content authors. So it's not simply just a form now where you type in complex authors. There is this building of a UI that needs to be simple, that others can just pick up intuitively. And that's an evolving process.
Yeah, I mean, we all know technology is only as effective as its adoption in the enterprise, right? And so if this is something that the organizational structure doesn't support, or if the user is rejected, if the change management isn't there, it doesn't matter how awesome your content model is, right? And so something we focus on a lot at Contentful is how do we build the most seamless, approachable user interface possible, so that non-technical folks like myself and like many others who are writing content, interacting with content, care about the content, can come in and manipulate it as they need within sort of the defined structures of the organization, and obviously in an approved and governed manner. Something we think about a lot.
Yeah. Well, now you're speaking my language, right? So I came to FFW actually without a technical background of any kind. So I used to be a marketing communications director, primarily in higher ed and nonprofits, and so I have a lot of war stories about trying to get content up on websites, on working with folks who struggled with that, struggling with it myself. And I think you're absolutely right. Governance is really key to this process. And I myself am a really big believer in like governance by tool set as much as possible, especially working in an environment like higher ed and nonprofits, which are very consensus based around decision making, and also tend to be really sort of open about lots of content editors and authors. And so then you start having to get in questions about editing permissions and setting those for folks, about setting up process for routing content for approvals, about making decisions about what pieces of content go where, about setting policies for how decisions should be made. Like a lot of times when I'm working with clients who are dealing with questions about how to redesign their entire site. They're sort of thinking of like the UX UI redesign. They're thinking of changes to their tech stack, the whole transformation. A lot of times what I will say to them is like, you may think you have like budget challenges. You might think you have technical challenges. What you really have most of the time are people challenges. And governance is absolutely critical. Adoption support is critical, especially for a tool like Contentful, which will be a different way of working with and thinking about content. But we found that talking about governance really early on is tremendously important to successfully like creating and I think maintaining a structured content model that will serve the organization going forward in the longer term.
And so I think when you take a content first approach, it really allows you to understand what that governance structure needs to be. Mm-hmm. And Contentful does a really good job of letting you break things down into very minute pieces so that you can give permissions to a very specific part of your system. So an example is SEO. Sometimes you have an actual agency who is managing that content for you, for all of your pages. Instead of building that out into each of your specific content types, sometimes you can extract that SEO into its own content type, and now you can give that permission to that outside agency to just manage that one thing, instead of having to give them access to all of your content across your system, which is maybe not something that you want to do.
And when we think about how that all flows and the processes around changing the permission set and the rules and the role types, I think Contentful has a pretty unique way of approaching that. Actually, I'm going to kick it to my solution engineer friend here to get into more details, but it's a little bit of a novel approach, and it's not just a super linear sort of click it, approve, comment, go mindset that we have.
Yeah, it's almost like an analogy is, train tracks, or those toy train tracks, where basically you can buy the train track that's just a circle, and it just goes around and around and around. Super easy to put together, super easy to get started up, versus a train track sort of building set where you've got different pieces of train tracks, and it can fork out into this direction. That's what Contentful has built out from a governance perspective when you're talking about workflows. Workflows aren't just linear. They go into all different directions, and we allow that opportunity, that option to basically define these complicated workflows that comes with complicated content. And so that's all the complexity. Make the complexity easy, but still allow that robustness that's available within those. We really look at a lot of the permissions, as was mentioned, because at each step of the stage in terms of workflows, there is like Who can do it? Who can look at it? Who can review it? Who can approve it? Those are the things that we build into it so that it makes it easy for someone that's non-technical to be able to define those in a way without you don't have to use code.
And what's cool is once you separate the content creation piece from sort of the linear publishing mindset, you can allow sort of this asynchronous work, and you don't have to rely on a specific waterfall approach. You don't need to rely on technical teams to take your new content live. You can work on it while the site gets built. They can be happening at the same time, and then those tracks can converge at the right point when it goes live for your users to take advantage of it. I mean, have you guys seen something similar? I mean, how does this come up in your work?
Oh yeah, we're consistently taking an agile approach and allowing our content editors to kind of get into Contentful earlier on, so that they can start migrating that content over, because what we see is oftentimes these are older systems that we're migrating from. They don't have the best structured content, and it's really difficult to programmatically migrate content. So our editors need more time to be able to get that content into the new system, and also just to refresh the content, because you don't want old stale content as you're doing a digital transformation.
I mean, it's kind of an opportunity too,
Yes.
right? Like it's sort of, we often see in development projects, we very rarely see a request. Well, sometimes we see requests for them, but we rarely recommend what we call the lift and shift, right? It's like a straight migration from an old stack or an old CMS to a new one. Like it's an opportunity to take stock of your content, of your design, of the whole thing. But similarly to some of the projects that I know you've worked on, Amanda, when I was working in marketing and communications at Stanford, and we did an upgrade to our site, we sort of used the tool set to kind of enforce some best practices and guidelines for the website. So, for example, my favorite example of this is, and for folks who work in higher ed, this is a big deal. We refused to create a content block that would permit like endless text. Like all of the content components that we created had like limits on how much text you could put in. Right. And that was, that's when I say like governance by tool set, that's some of the things that I mean. It's an opportunity to like take stock of the content you have, think about what content your organization needs, your users need, and really create that as you're moving, and taking the time to think that through strategically, because if, to your point, if programmatic migration isn't really going to work anyway, it's a perfect time to sit and think through how you want that to function going forward.
When you guys work with your customers on these transformations, what are the main business drivers that come up as you're thinking through, the impact that the transformation can have?
Typically, when clients come to us, they're going to come for one of four reasons. So number one is poor user experience on the site. So like either their users are struggling to engage, to find information, they're not converting at rates they're expected. So I would say probably like 7 times out of 10, people are saying like, we need a new UX UI. The second one is poor technology, right? So if they're on an older technology set, right, they're going to have performance issues. Maybe it's not secure. Maybe it's buggy. Maybe it's lagging. The third one is like similarly sort of like deadline-driven requirements. So for example, your CMS is sunsetting, eventually someday, maybe possibly it's going to reach its end of life, and you have to get off of it. So sometimes we see that like kind of deadline-driven, someone needs a change in their stack. And then the last one is a change to the organizational structure. So in higher ed and nonprofits, sometimes you'll see like they have like a proliferation of independent sites they want to consolidate. Or you will see like they want to pursue a new line of business, a new product, a new market they want to go after, et cetera. But I would say the sort of the UI challenges, the UX challenges, and the goal of making your site, your presence, your digital platform more coherent or cohesive, those tend to be the ones we see that have a lot to do with sort of content management and structure.
Create once, reuse everywhere.
Exactly.
There's one thing to remember.
Exactly.
And I think another key driver when our customers are coming to us and talking about poor UX or having issues with their sites and users finding things, a lot of the time it's because their content strategies are business-centric instead of user-centric. So a lot of the things that we do at FFW are driven by object-oriented UX, which is a framework for basically thinking about your content as objects and then figuring out the relationships between those objects and then building your system around that. And that's really how you start a content model as well. That's a conceptual content model. And as you build that up, then you can get to just going into the Contentful interface and building that content model out yourself, even just as a content designer. So we as content designers at FFW go into Contentful, we build the content model for our clients' editors, and then we pass that off to them. So it's not even a development step anymore. We're allowing our clients to get into their CMS so much earlier than they ever have, honestly.
I love that because it's sort of this idea like, yeah, your internal organization may be siloed. Good for you. Don't make that your customer's problem, right? Exactly. And why are you letting that bleed over into your design? And it's what really blows my mind when you start looking about it that way is content becomes the foundational building block, right? If you can effectively manage the content and if you can cut through your internal silos and your internal politics with a tool that enables you to easily do that can be easily quickly adopt and deployed, you can actually sort of shortcut your digital transformation from your customer's perspective, because now all of a sudden they're seeing, instead of, this line of business and this line of business and this line of business have 3 dropdowns, you're able to build a site that says, actually, customers, what are you most commonly trying to do on our site? Let's put that as the 3 top parts, right? And with the right content tool, you can sort of skip across all of the millions of hours of internal meetings of redoing the org and just get to the point, which is, get more leads or more clicks or a better user experience.
Yeah, and this is exciting because that's what makes this sort of Contentful work with FFW in terms of like solving this solution. We see so many times where Contentful is technical. I'm a technical person. I'm a tinker. Sometimes I'll build something absolutely crazy, and all they really need is just a title. It's the strategy aspect of it, like you mentioned, understanding the strategic sort of approach to something may not necessarily match up with how I look at things, because I've got all these nice Lego sets and I want to use every single part of it. So we need the check, and that's where things are really coming into play in terms of a partnership. There's the strategy, and then there's the tactician part of it that goes into that.
It's amazing how much of a light bulb moment it really is to talk to clients and other organizations about how everyone's site over time sort of comes to reflect their organizational structure, as you're saying, like rather than what the users need. I remember we worked recently with a client whose different departments absolutely insisted that their user needs were completely unique, and they had like very, very specific requirements, and and that the platform was going to have to accommodate all sorts of edge cases, right? Like every possible potential conversion, sale activity, inquiry, and everything. And so we started with user research. And what we found out was that although these departments, the personas of their users were distinct, what they came to the site to do was pretty much the same, right? So they wanted to find product information. They wanted to learn where they could buy it locally. And they wanted to potentially contact their sales rep. Right. And that was pretty much it.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it's pretty great.
And that's, it's sort of this idea of how do you orchestrate that dance, right? Across the different internal teams as they're building the content, as, they're managing and manipulating the content. Okay, maybe that does live in different worlds in the system, right? At Contentful, we call it spaces, right? So maybe there's a legal space and they, do all the fine print at the header and the footer in their own language, whatever they do, whatever the lawyers do. And then, then there's the space for the B2B team and the space for the B2B, right? We can separate that out and then allow the system to cross-reference across spaces. So you get sort of this best of both worlds idea, right? Where you can say, okay, you're all special snowflakes. Everyone's, got your own approach. Perfect. Yeah. Guess what? When it gets to the website, we're all pulling it all together in the way that works, right?
Exactly. And that's, the content may be different from each of those different lenses, but the user's lens is just one thing.
Yeah.
They want the same thing. So that user experience needs to be the same, but the content may need to be different. So being able to have those different spaces, kind of supply that from different areas, really allows for some of that business-centric thinking that often drives UX, which is not great. But it allows that business-centric thinking in a way that's really useful.
Well, and so I find this type of thing particularly useful for some of the verticals we work with that are more heavily regulated, right? So pharmaceuticals, medical technology, that kind of thing. When you have content that needs to be segregated, for lack of a better term, like that needs to be kept separate for regulatory compliance reasons, that's a good way to be able to manage that, but still make it accessible. And I think, again, like especially when you're dealing with compliance issues, or with any kind of sort of more complex approval processes, right? It really helps, again, to have a tool that makes that as smooth as possible. And also, I feel like enables you, as you said, to kind of do a little bit of an end run around some of the like endless sort of internal political challenges. Like if you have a tool that is able to meet the needs of sort of multiple internal users for multiple sets of requirements, we find that soothes a lot of potential like angst about making changes, because we definitely find with our clients changing to a new tech stack can be really anxiety inducing. And most folks are concerned about, sort of their area of focus as is natural, right? And I've found on projects in the past, like the right set of tools for the job can enable you to meet what seems like contradictory needs in the same space, right? So once we introduced a new CMS that both enabled greater brand compliance by having pre-created components that were brand compliant, but allowed our individual content editors to mix and match those in any way that they saw fit, which gave them what they wanted, which was greater autonomy.
So actually, the mix and match made me think of Amanda's world around content modeling. So how do those requirements fit into the content modeling when you're working with your customers?
So generally what we do is we'll come up with a design system that is going to meet all of those mix and match needs, but we're going to think about how do we standardize what some of those components or some of those templates are trying to achieve, and then structure the content in a way that you can still reuse it, but it gives you that flexibility. Another way that we do this is we'll kind of take these pieces of larger scale content. So let's use an article as a concept. We'll take that article and then we'll be able to put that into many different components within our system. So let's say we have kind of a related content type of component that would go at the bottom of a page or something to kind of drive traffic once a user has gotten through the content that they were looking for. You would be able to place those articles into this component in a way that it's a little bit more reusable than if we were designing this based on that specific component only.
Yeah, and it comes to the strategy aspect of it, in that this content modeling exercise forces people to think about, what are we doing with this content? Because oftentimes we find that we're talking to folks and they're like, oh, we want to be able to embed an image, and we want to do this, and then they forget that, oh, wait a minute, we're just creating content for a social media feed. And all of a sudden, let's go take a step back. Are we doing the right thing? So yeah.
I feel like we have that conversation a lot with clients who often come to us and they're very excited about some of the latest and greatest new technology. So a couple of years ago it was personalization engines. Now it's AI. And there's absolutely like places for a lot of these incredibly complex tools. But from a content perspective, a lot of times we'll talk to the client and be like, what problem are you trying to solve here? And they're like, well, our users can't find the content they're looking for. And we're like, well, so before you go into an incredibly complex set of additional tools, have you considered organizing your content in a way that makes sense to them? Just maybe we'll start there.
Exactly. Which leads to efficiency, because a lot of times they forget about the efficiency aspect. They're like, oh, we want to be able to do this, and this. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden you've now got a bloated efficiency or process that reduces the efficiency. And it's just sort of like, oh, wait a minute, we just lost sight of what our real problem was, is we can't get enough information out quick enough. That's
when you get into the visual design of things, a lot of the time you kind of lose track of what that content model really needs to be. And being able to put content modeling at the forefront of our practice now has really helped us to make sure that we are building systems that are not getting too complex or that aren't getting bloated, because we're not thinking about the display only of that thing anymore. We're thinking about, okay, well, there is this unique piece of content that I may need to reuse in a lot of the components within my design system. And instead of thinking about, okay, well, I'm going to put it here, and I'm going to put it here, and I'm going to put it here, and thinking about each of those things as unique entities, we're bringing it back to the piece that's feeding it, which is that article or that thing that we're now kind of embedding in other areas.
And that's what makes it sustainable, right? Like the other important consideration that we have when we work with a client to stand up a system like this is not just like what's going to solve your problem right now, but what's going to work for you for the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, right? I mean, that's a millennium in technology years, but for most organizations, making a change of this nature is a huge undertaking, and enabling them with a tool set that enables sort of like ongoing optimizations and changes, like the kind of flexible structure that enables them to change to meet what their needs are going to be a few years from now, we find is absolutely critical in thinking through this process. Not just like what needs to go up on your site in time for your campaign launch next week, but what are you going to need next year? What are you going to need in 3 years? What are you going to need in 5 years?
Or what about that last minute Black Friday project that all of a sudden it's end of October, you haven't shipped it yet. How are you going to get that done? Do you have a model that allows you to get that up and live before your, company-wide code freeze that's happening imminently? And yeah, that scalability is a huge part of it.
Yeah, and even with the modeling aspect of it, there's also the UI aspect of it, which is what Contentful, I think, really excels at, is how do we simplify this for people? Because not only is the content going to change quickly, but the workflows that are tied to those also change. And that's how robust our platform is and helps FFW in terms of like, oh, we've got this change. Oh, we need to launch something. How do you incorporate that, again, without the use of developers and IT and complex systems? It's all sort of an easy-to-use system that you can just schedule things to go out. And then also integrate future technologies that are coming into play that we haven't foreseen in, especially like with AI, for example. Yeah. Who knows what that's going to come out with.
Well, and bottlenecks are just a perennial problem, right? For every organization we've worked with. And, it's not always the same type of bottleneck, but yeah, having to run through, you always run through this sort of the diametrically opposed problems, right? If either you have sort of consolidated, centralized control management production, which is great for brand consistency, for coherence of the user experience, but really challenging for like getting stuff done. Like you have all the user requests, kind of like your internal user requests kind of coming through here and getting stuck. Or you have a lot of content editor autonomy across your organization. And then you start to struggle with consistent user experience, with brand compliance, with a coherent movement through your ecosystem. And again, like that's I love finding like pairing a technical solution with the sort of strategy that it needs to be successful, and crucially adoption support as well, right? Like making sure folks have a chance to get to know the tool and really sort of thrive with it over time.
You had mentioned earlier that kind of brought this that I was interested in learning more about is pushing content out, not pushing content, but directionally we're communicating with something, and then now the request is communicating back, or that communication is coming back. How do you see that sort of continuing to evolve over time?
Well, when we talk about content syndication with a lot of our clients, most people think of it as going one way, right? There's going to be, again, you sort of have a central like marketing team, business team, what have you, that is pushing content out to a variety of sources around the organization, sometimes around the world. But we often find that clients are interested in having that syndication go two ways, right? And so they are interested in a tool that has the flexibility to account for, and maybe it's, that's like 75-25, right? It's mostly going one way, but they really want to account for those cases where it's coming in a different direction. And so again, like giving sort of like the permissions and flexibility for content authors across different aspects of the organization to produce and provide and push content while still remaining sort of within whatever parameters are set by the organization is just absolutely critical, again, not only to actually enable that work, but to kind of head off some of the internal challenges and concerns about how that gets set up. Because a lot of these projects get stalled by that. They get stalled by people going, I don't want to, I'm afraid of giving up my autonomy, or I'm afraid of giving up control. And you move away from the challenges of what is our tech stack, what is our organizational model, and into sort of like people, again, like it's a question of their comfort level with making these changes.
And even the opposite, as a non-technical person, sometimes I'm like, why can't that one talk to that one?
Yeah.
Right? Why? I don't understand. They're computers. Can't the computers talk? Isn't that all we do all day long is have computers talk? And I'm working with a large financial services organization right now who they're stuck with this. They said like two very large old school pieces of on-premise technology, and they will not interact.
Right.
And it's sort of like, how did we get here? After all of the innovation, these things won't talk to each other.
Yeah.
And so, for Contentful, we've effectively outsourced our platform, our APIs to our customers and our partners. There is a very robust UI that we've developed. There are installable apps on top of that UI that we've developed, but we've also let, our best technology partners and service providers build their own things with Contentful, so that, at any point, basically any company any technology that can interact with APIs can play nice with Contentful, to the point where from a user, from that, the dumb non-technical user interacting with it.
You don't even know.
I don't even know. I don't even know, right? Like, wow, all this product information is showing up here. Magical, right? This is great.
And that's the basis of being able to have these systems talk to each other, is having a strong content model. Because if you don't have a strong content model that understands that there are these two separate systems that need to communicate.
At least two. Maybe 4, maybe 5. But if you can't have a content model that can accommodate that, then you're not going to be able to make them talk to each other, because you need that structure, that basis, that core of that piece of content that needs to be syndicated in both ways to have the structure that it needs to, so that those pieces can align. Because a lot of the time when we're dealing with these older systems, that structure isn't there, and that's why they can't talk to each other. So thinking about content and thinking about what is the core structure that I need for this individual thing so that I can put it across many different systems is so important. Well, and the more complex and the older these systems are, the more intimidating it becomes to make the change. And the more you start to, you put it off. We've seen over the years, organizations come up with what we like to call a Frankenstein, right? Where like a lot of customizations have been made to meet individual needs as you go, but that wasn't done with this sort of kind of foundational strategic thinking in mind, whether about the content or the technology. And so what we try to do is move clients onto the kinds of systems that enable incremental change over time, or have that kind of flexibility to be able to, rather than, when they need a new feature or functionality, next year, instead of having to heavily customize their CMS, they have an API first system that enables them to add that functionality with, hopefully a minimum of trauma.
That's also why when we have customers that come to us for a redesign, but they don't really want to redo the content structure behind it, we're like, we need to do that first so that you can continue building and scaling. Because if we don't do that now, it's going to be much more difficult to be able to add on to that in the future. So we need to really make content the core of what we're doing, or else you're not going to be able to scale and optimize.
Yeah, it's a sort of you'll thank me later type of situation.
Yes.
And so for Contentful, what that means is really providing tooling and frameworks that empowers content authors, which is why within our roadmap, we have a concentration on collaboration tools. As they go through the workflows, the ability for all these individual contributors, because it's not just one content author anymore, it's multiple teams in different locations, as well as even translations, where they need to collaborate with each other. And we want to have a unified space that this can happen in to help manage that.
Speaking of that, we just did a demo for one of our clients. It was the first time we were showing them their content model and showing them how they could enter content into their system. And we showed them the comment feature, which you can comment on the entire page that you're editing and you're leaving content. Let's say you have a workflow where you need to pass this to someone else, but you don't want to, hold up the rest of the page. You can put your content in as you please, but you can leave a comment for a specific piece of content on the page as well. So you can take a specific field and say, hey, at so-and-so, I would like you to review this. This is ready for your review. And the client was amazed, like jaw-dropping. They were so excited that they could not only say this entire page is ready for review, but take specific pieces, send it to other people to say, hey, can you fill the rest of this in for me? And they were so excited about that specific feature.
I've seen this so many times when working with clients that, we talk about the overall, the strategy, the way that this will help. They come to us with a problem. We recommend a technical and a content and a governance solution that we think will help them move to market more quickly. And then 9 times out of 10, what gets somebody excited about the solution is like the thing, like the one thing that will make their job easier, right? That will make it easier for them to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish on behalf of the organization. And it's such an interesting sort of back and forth between sort of finding the thing that your stakeholders are really excited about, that give them a chance to see how this can help them, and going into the sort of the bigger picture, right? So like when we sit down with a potential client to talk about the changes they want to make, they'll often come to us and say, all right, like our users can't find their content, or our CMS is broken, or this and that, and I want this tool and that tool and the other thing. And I like to step back and ask some really stupid questions, like, why do you have a website? Who is it for? What is it for? And forcing the answers to those questions, it almost always comes down to content, right? Like why do you have a website? It's typically so you can get information to your customers, or to your constituency, or to your students in higher ed, to your patients, to doctor, like whoever you're trying to reach. It's about making sure it's easy for them to find that information. And so we often have this sort of back to basics conversation that ideally guides the overall strategy, but in particular, I think also guides decisions made about content, in thinking through, again, like, what does the user need from this? Like, how are we making it easy for them to find and engage with it?
Well, and I think that really helps drive our content first approach, which is we're putting content at the forefront of the experience, and we're making it so that you can change your user experience over time as you need, as user needs evolve, as your business needs evolve. But that core piece of content that we're spending so much time to structure correctly can stay the same. But the experience can always change.
Yep.
So I think that's a struggle that we see with a lot of our customers. They come to us and the system is so interdependent on content and user experience, where we really need to keep them separate so that content can always have these structures that probably don't need to change as often as the user experience itself needs to change.
Yeah. It's like, it reminds me of a story that reminds me where the simple things make such a big difference. Yes. There was a story I heard one time from my engineering days where there was a school bus that was trying to get through a tunnel, but the clearance of the tunnel was just 1/4 of an inch too low. Bus couldn't fit. So they brought in a tunnel engineer and they said, well, we can reconstruct the tunnel to have that extra inch, but it'll take, 2 years. Then another guy came in, a physicist came in and said, I can build a molecular machine that can reduce the size of the bus. And then the kindergartner came out and said, how about we just deflate the tires? And it was the simple things that came through. And that's what the content model actually allows for, is like, hey, we don't have to change the whole thing. Maybe a small adjustment to the content model, or just something that's in there.
Adding a field, because now there's this specific user need that it's calling for additional content, but you don't have to change your entire system to just add that field in.
Exactly.
And businesses are so, rightfully so, obsessed with measuring the impact of everything, right? What is the impact of going from 5 weeks to for an update to 5 minutes, or 30% better, more people clicking on the link on the site, right? All these things obviously matter, right? But at the end of the day, if the content isn't getting updated, it doesn't matter how long it takes you to get it on your website, right? If what the user clicks on doesn't actually go anywhere, or leads them down a rabbit hole that won't ultimately convert in a sale, it doesn't matter that they clicked on it more or not, right? And so if your content editors and if your content model itself, and if you're not sort of making that the most important element of your digital experience, then you're missing out and you're not focusing on the right pieces.